And standby title sequence. Let's talk about calling a show. My name is Kent, and this is your half-hour call. Title sequence, go. Attention cast and crew, this is your half-hour call. Half hour to the top of the show. Half hour. Alrighty friends, we are back with yet another episode of the Almost Complete Guide to Stage Management. This week we are talking all about the theory behind calling a show, which is one of my favorite duties of the stage manager. But if this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Kent, and you are watching Half Hour Call, where we're dedicated to shining the spotlight on technical theater. So if you want how-to videos, interviews with industry leaders, and insider theater updates, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you never miss another video. Calling a show is the most direct connection and impact the stage manager has on the performance of a show. Done right, it is seamless, beautiful, and oh so satisfying, but it takes preparation and practice to get it there. But what is calling a show, and why do we do it? Well, for every performance, the stage manager calls the cues, meaning that they signal for everything on stage to happen. Lights, sound, fly rail, automation, deck, or scene changes, some actor entrances, special effects, all of it flows through the stage manager, who's following along with a special copy of the script in front of them that has all the cues written in it, often referred to as the call script. When calling a show, think of yourself as the conductor of an orchestra. Your job is to take what has been written and rehearsed and bring it to life. Sure, the orchestra could probably function without a conductor, but in order to truly be in sync and respond as a cohesive unit to the small but significant changes in every performance, someone needs to guide the group. Instead of a baton, you have a headset and cue lights, and instead of instruments, you have board operators and actors, but the concept is still the same. And just like a conductor, a good stage manager will get into the rhythm of the actors, the audience, and the show itself. I'm fairly certain I've said this in every single video in the Almost Complete Guide to Stage Management, but once again, every stage manager has a slightly different style when it comes to calling the show. None of them are correct, and as long as it works, none of them are wrong either. As long as the method results in the show being consistently executed safely and correctly, it's a successful calling method. That said, I'm going to do something I rarely do on this channel and speak in absolutes. Every good calling system features two things. 1, flexibility, and 2, prioritization. Failure to allot for either of these two when developing your calling system means that it will not work for you in the long term. And before we get started, we definitely need to prioritize hitting the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Let's break down the anatomy of a cue. Every cue has 3 parts: the department, the cue identifier, which is usually a number or a letter, and the go. In context, it'll sound like this. Lights 11, go. While every cue has all 3 parts, you might not have time to say all 3 parts in your call. If it's a complex show, especially for upbeat musical numbers, you'll likely have to be flexible with your call and prioritize which parts of a cue you say. Let's look at each part in more detail from the highest priority to the lowest priority. The most important part of a cue is the go, sometimes referred to as the trigger, sometimes referred to as the cue, but referring to part of a cue as a cue is really confusing, so for the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to it simply as the go. This is the signal for the action to happen. It can be an action, a word, a beat in the music, another cue previously called, a time on a stopwatch, an audience reaction, literally anything. The go also doesn't have to be spoken by the stage manager. In the old days, stage managers called cues by ringing bells, and fly rail operators communicated by whistling. A go can be a cue light, programmed into timecode, or taken by the board op on their own, but most commonly the stage manager actually says the word go into their headset to let the crew member know to do the thing. This is the most important part of the cue. In fact, for a significantly fast sequence, you might just say the word go for several cues. For example, you might say, lights 21, go, 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 go. Lights 25, go. The go is priority number 1. The silver medal for importance to a cue is the department. Whether it's a light cue, sound effect, scene change, fly rail cue, or something else entirely, it's important that your technicians know who you're talking to, and therefore who should respond to the next go. Before I go into tech, I like to sit down and consider all the departments I'll be calling. I'll write them out and actually say them out loud to see if any are A, too long, B, too difficult to say, or C, too similar to any other departments. So carpenters generally becomes deck, Fly rail becomes simply rail, projections might become slide or image or video or tab, automation can become auto if there is only one automation system, but if both deck and fly queues have automation in it, it may need to become auto fly and deck auto to differentiate them. One big divide among stage managers is whether electrics or light queues should be referred to as LX or simply lights. In the United States, it doesn't really matter. Most board ops will respond to either. It's my understanding that in the UK, LX is standard. Personally, lights flows more easily out of my mouth, and I find LX to be too close to effects for my liking. While we're on the subject, there's really no need to include the word queue when calling. If I say lights 7 go, the operator knows it's light queue 7, and you're just adding another word to trip on and making it harder for yourself. The only exception I can think of for this would be if you're standing by a manual fly queue and you're describing what happens, like stand by rail queue 4, line 12, in on a 5 count. In that case, it may be helpful to differentiate when you're saying the queue number and the line number. Defer to your fly rail operators, but even then, it's not really that helpful. The least, but still pretty darn important part of a queue is the identifier. This is the letter or number that signifies which queue in their queue list you're calling. Lights 7 or sound H. For this, I always default to the designer. Some sound designers give you letters to differentiate from light cues, others give numbers. I don't find that it's worth it to try and change what the designers have already been working on. In tech, cues will likely be added and cut left and right. Some cues will be auto-follow, which means they'll automatically play the next cue after the first cue. Often, designers will add point cues when they need to insert a cue between two whole numbers, so you might call light 47, then light 47.1, then light 48. This means that the odds of your cue identifiers being sequential by opening night are slim to none. In that same vein, some stage managers like to create a single massive cue list where no letters or numbers repeat. So lights and sound might both have a cue 10, but lights has a cue 11, then sound has a cue 12, then rail has a cue 13, and so on. Unless you have a very generous amount of tech time or are remounting a show that's already been produced, I don't think it's worth it. If you articulate clearly, the risk of the same number being used in multiple departments actually causing a problem is much lower than the risk that changing everyone's cue numbers to be nice, neat, sequential cues will result in cues being missed. All this to say, your best bet is more often than not to be flexible and to default to what the designer gives you. But why is this the lowest priority? Well, for one, in a tight queue sequence, the queue identifier will often have the most syllables and therefore be the most likely to trip up your tongue when calling. Two, most departments, especially ones with lots of cues like lights and sound, are automated. The board operator is just pressing the space bar, so the odds of doing cues out of sequence are much lower. Plus, after a complex sequence, you or your board op can always confirm that you're in the queue that you're supposed to be in. There's a good chance that you were taught that every cue gets a warning, a standby, and a go, and that the warning happens 1 to 2 minutes before the go, the standby 15 to 30 seconds before, and the go a beat before the cue needs to be executed. This is an okay place to start, and fine if you're just teaching broad concepts, but in practice it's not a great system. First, it fails our test of flexibility and prioritization. Using rigid systems like this means that your warnings, standbys, and goes will all be jumbled together and you'll probably never stop talking for the entire show, and not communicating as clearly as you could be if you better prioritized your call. Second, from what I can tell, warnings from light cues come from the days of two-scene preset light boards, where the board op had to physically set each individual fader before executing the cue. If this is the case in your theater, then by all means call warnings for light cues, because they're probably needed. But with most light boards having a single go button, it's a bit much. In reality, a warning should come when someone needs to start getting ready for a cue. A standby should come when they need to be ready to execute a cue, and the go still a beat before it needs to be executed. That last part stands the test of time. But not every cue needs a warning, a standby, and a go. Again, for cues that are executed with the click of a button, specifically lights and sound, you don't need much more than the cue itself, with a breath in between the identifier and the go. If you're working with a professional board operator, they should be paying attention the entire time. I use standbys sparingly. For me, standbys are for complex sequences where I will not be giving all three parts of the cue, the department, the identifier, and the go. If I'm skipping any of those in any cue in a sequence, I'll add a standby. For example, if I were calling a light cue and a sound cue for a lightning strike, I might say, standby lights 21 and sound 3, lights go, sound go. The only time I'll stand by individual cues is if there has been a significant gap in between cues. If it's been long enough since the last light cue for the operator to unwrap a sandwich or open a book, I'll throw in a standby to make sure they have some extra notice. There are some stage managers who want their board ops to respond to a standby in some fashion, often saying standing by or saying their department name to acknowledge the standby. Generally, I don't find this necessary, and certainly not for lights and sound cues. Again, if you're working with professional board ops, you can trust them to do their jobs. The only time I've had a technician specifically respond to a standby over headset is when arming pyrotechnics, which is a whole other beast all on its own. Warnings, on the other hand, are when someone needs to prepare for a cue. This would be for deck cues, rail cues, automation, anything that needs to get ready. Rather than a prescriptive 1 to 2 minutes before the go, I put warnings in at a convenient time in the show that gives enough time for the technician to get ready for their appropriate cue. This will vary by department. Carpenters on the deck will need more time to prepare for a scene change than the automation operator. I'll also use warnings with cue lights, which we'll talk about in a minute, and at the top of the show to give everybody some extra notice that we'll be starting shortly. Generally warning the entire act's light and sound cues at once. The go comes just a moment before the cue needs to happen. Remember that the technicians most likely can't see you, so you'll need to account for human reaction time. Let's do an experiment. I'm going to call a cue, and you clap your hands when I call it. Ready? Clap 1, go. Clap 2, go. Clap 3, go. Now, did it sound like this? Go. Or did it sound like this? Go. Unless you're a superhuman or a robot, or you're watching this video for a second time, it was probably the second one. Especially in musical numbers where cues are often timed to specific beats, it is crucial to be in the pocket for the entire show. This predictable rhythm becomes even more important when you have substitute board operators who are not as familiar with the show. Cue lights are another method of cue calling and is one of the most stark differences between stage managing in the United States and the United Kingdom. So for this, I'm specifically talking about cue calling in the United States. If you've ever seen images of a stage manager's calling station with huge panels of switches in front of them, those are cue lights. Essentially, cue lights are just colored light bulbs throughout the theater that the stage manager controls from their desk to non-verbally call cues. They turn on at the warning or standby and turn off at the go. Selecting the placement of cue lights usually falls to the production stage manager, and at most theaters, cue lights are in limited supply. So once again, we return to our themes of flexibility and prioritization. Every theater is different, but these rules should give you a place to start. First priority are things that cannot be cued verbally, like the sound mixer or the conductor or actor entrances if needed. Since these people are generally not on headset, cue lights are necessary. Second priority are things that could kill or seriously injure someone. This would include things like fly rail, automation, pyrotechnics, among others. The reason for this is pretty simple, but also pretty genius. If these dangerous departments are listening for a go over headset, especially in a cue-heavy show, there's a significant risk that they'll mistakenly take their cue at the wrong go, or that the stage manager will get tongue-tied and call their cue wrong. However, if they have a cue light, the only way for them to take the cue early is if the stage manager flips a switch at the wrong time, which is much less likely to happen. I still give verbal warnings when I turn on the cue light, just in case there's a malfunction and the light doesn't turn on. That way, the technician has a chance to let me know that their light didn't turn on, and I can use a verbal go as a contingency plan. If your show has multiple cues back to back for these departments, adding a second, third, or even fourth cue light in different colors allows you to put several rail cues on standby at once, for example, and not have to flip the same light on and off and on and off and on and off. Pro tip, if there are any dangerous scenic elements like trapdoors in the set, it can be helpful to ask for a cue light in the back of the house that is visible from the stage. This way you can turn it on when the actors need to be aware of the hazard and off when it's safe. For example, if the trapdoor is unlocked or open, the light would be on, but once it's safe to walk across, it would be turned off. Speaking of dangerous scenic elements, the ASMs on the deck can play a crucial role in calling the show. Since the stage manager has a very limited vantage point, they may rely on the assistant stage managers to let them know when it's safe to call a cue. For instance, if the actors on the apron need to exit before the main curtain comes down for intermission, an ASM will generally be tasked with watching the actors exit and calling clear over headset so the stage manager can call the cue, usually by turning off a cue light. This is just part one of the behemoth topic that is calling shows. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss part 2, where we'll put the theory we just discussed into more practical tips. Thank you so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing. My name is Kent, and this has been your half-hour call.
Find the perfect gift for the stage manager in your life at the Half Hour Call store. Now with free shipping on all domestic orders. New products added frequently. Visit KentJamesCollins.com/store to shop now.